Hello, Dark Reader, and welcome to the Dark Side of the Library podcast. I'm your host, Katie, and today on this Minisode, I just wanted to say Happy New Year. I've been doing a couple batch recordings, and I realized on my previous one, I was like, this is the first video recording I'm doing, and it's not. This actually is. So I wanted to actually catch up with y'all because I have been gone from the Minisodes. And I have to be perfectly honest, there have been a huge slew of books that I picked up for every single minisode, and a lot of them I had to DNF. Because my New Year's resolution, I have to be honest, usually I'm not a resolution-y person. I feel like I should just be, try to be better all the time. But my thing has been to not care if I have to DNF a book, because there's just only so much time. Life is too short. If I don't enjoy something, don't force myself to read it. And I wanted to read some classics. I've been trying to keep up with all of the new book trends and there's a ton of new novels. If you do keep up with our podcast, we have at least 20 plus books for every single subsect just for horror novels. So I was like, I need to make some time for some classics because for me, I haven't had a book that's hit me in a while, something that's new and that feels really profound. So I wanted to pick up some things that I've been wanting to read, but they're a little older. So today I wanted to talk about 3 novels that I have read to kind of keep up with the times, and ones that maybe you have missed as well, but one is a classic novel, and 2 of them are, I guess you would call contemporary classic novels. So let me talk about the first one that I read a little earlier in December, and that is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. So Gillian Flynn seems to be kind of the mark that a lot of people want to hit when they are writing a psychological thriller. It just seems like Gone Girl was like one of those big peak novels that a lot of thriller authors are like, I need to hit that Gillian Flynn Gone Girl moment. So I watched the Gone Girl movie when it did come out, and it has taken me forever, clearly a whole decade, to read the novel itself. And I have to say, I liked the movie a little bit better. So I wanted to just talk about that pretty fast. So maybe you haven't read Gone Girl yourself, and maybe it's been a book that you're like, maybe I should read it because I love thrillers, but you've watched the movie and you're like, well, I should probably read the book too. You don't necessarily have to. I did enjoy this book, but I have to say the characters were some of the worst people in the entire world that I've actually read about. Not just our Amy, but our Nick is also pretty crappy in this novel. The movie with Ben Affleck makes it just, I don't know, for some reason you want to side with somebody. You want to at least feel something for your characters. Nick in the book, I would argue, is not even a protagonist. They're both miserable people. So honestly, I didn't mind reading that. I thought it was kind of a fun, petty, I feel like petty is not even a good word to describe it because this book is over the top. So it describes like this very unhealthy, very toxic relationship, 2 very toxic people, and how that devolves into Gone Girl. There were a few things in Gone Girl that I actually enjoyed, and maybe it was a bit of a guilty pleasure. In my generation, we had a lot of people, especially girls, when I was growing up in high school, they'd be like, well, I'm not like those other girls. So it was interesting with Amy's character when we get her little flip where she's not like this, adorable American sweetheart who's got everything going for her and she's so awesome and sweet and smart and perfect. So Amy goes into this big diatribe about how girls are like this and they want this thing, and the ones that try to pretend like they aren't that way to make it seem like they're the cool girls. I had to be honest, I felt like I agreed with that because there's a few, granted, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but I noticed that a lot of my girlfriends who were like, well, I'm not like the other girls. And it was like demeaning. Like, what is the problem with being like the other girls and having expectations and, wanting a partner who equally contributes. What's the problem there? But I'm not one of the girls. Like, I'm okay with you behaving X like this. So there were some parts in there where I think it resonates with people. In addition to that, I read the Goodreads reviews on this book, and granted, that was about a decade ago. So it's interesting, some of the reviews talk about how just vicious and toxic and horrible this book can be, or how insipid it is. And yes, I agree, but it's interesting because it feels like this book honestly is not as bad as some of the later novels that I have read. Some of the characters or couples describing different relationships and stuff like that. Honestly, this book sometimes isn't even up to par with some of the newer books. So that was an interesting difference between how we've viewed toxic relationships or behaviors 10 years ago versus now, which is interesting because I feel like we've been talking about it, and yet our tolerance for it in books is we are way more accepting of toxic behavior. I don't know. Granted, most characters aren't going out and killing people to manipulate a situation like Amy does in Gone Girl, but there's a lot of really toxic stuff that's beyond this book in some newer novels. So there's a few things in here that are really interesting. It was a good book, in my opinion. Parts of it were a little slow and it dragged on a little bit, but overall I enjoyed it, especially when we had Amy finally showing her true colors. The book started to increase its pace substantially, but I liked the foundation where you're convinced that the characters, you've got perfect little Amy and Nick, who's just kind of like meh about his marriage, and he knows he is, and he's just like, I don't give a shit. And then it flips the script and it gets extra interesting. So next on our list, I had to return this to the library, but I finally had the opportunity to read The Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. There's been, I don't know, the TikTok algorithm has been calling me out. I don't know. It's like, you need to read Oscar Wilde, because it kept showing me all of these Oscar Wilde quotes with like really pretty music. And I'm like, ooh, I really resonate with Oscar Wilde. Like, I love all of these quotes in here. So I was like, I should actually read The Portrait of Dorian Gray. I'll make this one really short. This is a classic, and I think this one is really fun. I never had the opportunity to read this while I was in college or school at all. I don't know why that wasn't an option. We didn't have cool stuff for some reason. Anyway, so The Portrait of Dorian Gray is a fantastic novel, but as people have said, it reads kind of like a script. Dorian cries all the time. So it's definitely like a play, the way it's written. The conversations and the narrative and the dialogue between the characters is really great. But then sometimes you get lost in just the writing. It was a great novel. It was a little slow, I'm not gonna lie. But it was really fun when you did have a dialogue with the characters. And I loved, there was more than just the message of like dealing with aging. They have the Dorian syndrome and being afraid of aging and beauty. There's a lot of cool discussion or things being brought up about being a hedonist. Just some of the disadvantages. Like, some of us might think, yes, let's just embrace all of the pleasures of life and just let it soak up in our lives and screw everybody else. It's all about you. And it's interesting because you can see the negative effects it actually has. I liked the vastly different characters between Dorian. We had Basil, and we have Lord Henry. And one thing I wanted to note, it was interesting because when I was reading in the very beginning, Oscar Wilde did a fantastic job making Lord Henry incredibly charismatic. And you're kind of like, wow, for some reason, I really just want to listen to what he's saying. He's very philosophical. He's got a really interesting worldview. And you're like, wow, that I can kind of relate to some of this stuff. And, I want to care less about some of these things that people tend to care about. And then you realize just the road starts to progress and to become darker and darker, and the world you start to live in your own little dark bubble, even though you are living this life of pleasure, but it's never enough, and you just constantly want more and more and more. So Dorian Gray is a great story all around. You have a lot of those gothic, creepy undertones throughout the story, but it's not in your face like you see a lot of newer novels these days. Obviously, just like slap you in the face with it. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it, but just so you're aware, it can be a little dry. There's a lot of character analysis you can do in this, and you can sort of just dissect this novel, and it becomes just a bigger thing than it was. Just Oscar Wilde does a great job. But you can tell it's not necessarily the most well-written novel. I'm not sure how else to say that. It is like there's a lot in there that just seems like a very long run-on sentence, or he reuses the same phrases over and over and over again, because it would have been great as a play versus a novel, because Oscar Wilde was a playwright, so it reads like that. So just be aware. But it was cool because regardless of how the writing just technically might have not been as great, the story itself was still immersive. So it's like one of those examples where you don't necessarily have to be a fantastic, like grammatically correct writer, but as long as you have like the structure and the essentials for storytelling. So the story itself is fantastic. The writing can still be a little messy, but you can still have an engaged and concise story. The last book I want to talk about today is Practical Magic. So I've never read Practical Magic, which is kind of crazy because I grew up with the movie with Sandra Bullock. Practical Magic, I always felt like I resonated with Sally, and my sister was a Gillian, so it was always like one of those things. And I never picked it up, but Carrie reads this book all the time. It's almost like a bi-yearly thing for her. Finally, I picked up this beautiful copy at the library. Holy cow, Alice Hoffman does this amazing job interweaving this beautiful story about Sally and Gillian, the two witches who live with their aunts, and Sally and her children, and how they grow up and how their family dynamic evolves over time. She was able to evolve and tell Sally and Gillian's childhood story all the way up to like early adulthood, and wove this beautiful, well-rounded story without too much. I'm not sure how else to describe it. She was able to really convey how Gillian and Sally are very different, and how not necessarily they were raised differently, but just their deep personality, their traits are different, and how that translated throughout time. But Alice Hoffman does this great job where it's just like this beautiful, I don't know, it's like this beautiful woven tapestry, but it didn't require that much string, if that makes any sense. She just takes the important vital information there and just conveys it, and most of the audience can fill in the rest of the blanks. Like, we know what a type A person looks like. We got Sally. She's got all of these things. She doesn't realize how beautiful she is. She's a little bit like of a skeptic. We kind of know, or we might be somebody like that. I'm really loving this book even more because one thing it does is it talks about family in such a good, interesting way. Like, I think the thing that the movie did that maybe I wish they took more from the book is that Sally and Jilly were not close because they had to be, not because they were like soul sisters, blood bonds, like what they did in the movie. It's basically kind of like trauma bonding. They grew up and were bullied, and then they only had each other. It was friends by proximity, but they are nothing alike. And they have all of this dynamic there is hard, but you choose to be with your family too. Like there's a choice there, and there's a lot of hardship, no matter if you're magical or not. So it's got a lot of this interesting family storytelling here with a magical element, and I really loved it. And I'm so glad that I've been reading it finally. I think this is definitely a contemporary classic. Alice Hoffman, beautiful writing style. I've never read any of her work, and I'm so glad I did. So I also recommend Practical Magic. If you've never, ever read the book, maybe you've only watched the movie, just like me, definitely check out the book. So that is kind of what I have been reading as of late. I know these aren't new reads, but they are really important novels, I think. And these stories have definitely influenced a lot of new authors. We have our sister witch stories, all the Hazelwood is a perfect example. A ton of psychological thrillers who are trying to get to Gone Girl. Some of them, honestly, they go so over the top, and this is what I've experienced a lot, where it's unbelievable. And Gone Girl really pushes the limit there too, where it's like, are Nick and Amy that believable? They are, but they're so close to just not. And then, of course, we have Portrait of Dorian Gray, which was one of those examples where it's like a good author has so many elements. There's just so much there. You don't have to necessarily have the technicalities, as long as you have this beautiful story that's concise and clear and doesn't do these weird, you don't need to have all these crazy twists and turns all the time. Unlike Gone Girl, which is the queen of twists and turns, but they also made sense. And then Alice Hoffman, beautiful writer, amazing writing style, magic in those words. She crafts this beautiful story and technically delivers a stunning narrative. So I highly recommend those 3 books if you've never read them before. So I will be doing more of those kinds of books. I do have some newer books that I am going to be shuffling into my minisodes. If you enjoy dark reads, stay tuned every Wednesday and Friday for new episodes. Make sure to check out our show notes just so you're aware. They are affiliate links. We do get a small commission for those. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you do enjoy dark reads, you can join us over on our socials. We'd love to see you there. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time.